Last time we spoke about the Eight-Nation Alliance's occupation of Beijing, the flight of the royal family, and the Boxer Protocol. Empress Dowager Cixi and her faithful guardian Dong Fusang fled to the northwest parts of China. Meanwhile, Beitang waited longer than most for their rescue, enduring an unbelievable amount of hardship during the siege. Poor old Li Hangzhang was forced to endure another humiliation on behalf of the Qing Dynasty, negotiating peace with the Western powers. The indemnity payments would last until World War II for China. Empress Dowager Cixi escaped any punishment, while other officials literally lost their heads. In an extravagant fashion, the Empress Dowager returned to Beijing performing a large spectacle. It was intentional and brilliant PR work. Things were going to dramatically change for China going forward. This episode is the Russo-Chinese War Part 1. Manchuria rises up. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Maybe you want to see something a bit more forward in time from this podcast? Check out my episode on the Xinhai Revolution. Also, please check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. A big thanks, I've had actually quite a few people join up recently. You guys are awesome. This month's exclusive podcast is on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. As we have seen, as of June 1900, the eyes of the world were focused on Beijing. The foreign diplomats of numerous nations were under siege by the fanatical Boxers and Qing forces such as the Gansu army. The Boxer Rebellion as a whole is captured by this focus. Go find any book on it, and there are many. What you often come across is the mention of Russian forces somewhat to the distance in Manchuria. Typically, if anything is said at all, you get a few paragraphs stating, when the escalations began, the Russians invaded Manchuria. Invaded Manchuria. That sounds like a hell of a story, no? It's simply overshadowed by the events that played out around Beijing. But an entire other war really sprang up in Manchuria. The event is virtually unknown to the West. When the Boxers sprang up and the expeditions emerged, the two closest powers were of course Japan and Russia. And as we have seen, when it came to the march upon Beijing, the Japanese sort of took the lion's share. Yet Russia was the most capable to rush troops to the scene, given her work on the Manchurian railways. The Boxer Rebellion was a bit of an awkward one for Russia. Yes, Russia took up the side of the Western forces and joined the Eight-Nation Alliance. However, her views on what exactly the Boxer Rebellion was differed from the rest. Russia felt the Boxer movement was not directed against her, but rather at the Manchu dynasty. Russia, in many ways, intervened to save the Manchu dynasty from a full-blown revolution. She saw the symptoms of the revolutionaries as a result of Western economic and missionary encroachment into China. Hell, even the Chinese, they often referred to Westerners as ocean devils. But the Russians, they did not come from the sea. They shared a vast border with the Chinese. Russia and China had a special relationship unlike the rest, one that had been going on for centuries. Russia typically acted with greater restraint and often spoke of Russo-Chinese friendship. But don't get me wrong. Like Britain, Germany, France, Japan, etc., Russia was definitely taking advantage of a weakened Qing dynasty. She certainly encroached, specifically in Manchuria. Their border was one of the longest frontiers in the world. Siberia was underpopulated and exposed to Chinese infiltration. A buffer zone existed in Manchuria and Mongolia. The Trans-Siberian Railway's construction began in 1891 for strategic and economic reasons. It was to be the world's longest railroad, initially thought to wind along the Amur River up to Khabarovsk, then south of Vladivostok. But the terrain proved hellish, the route too circuitous, thus a shortcut through Manchuria was strongly advised. In 1896, Russia obtained concessions from the Qing Dynasty to begin construction of a station on the Transbaikal section of the Siberian Railway. Following her lease of Port Arthur and Dalian, Russia then sought to connect a new railway line to the main line of what would be called the Manchurian Railway. Construction began from both ends simultaneously, at a pace of around 1.75 miles per day. Vladivostok and Port Arthur were linked up by July of 1900. It would not be too long until the Trans-Siberian Railway and the Chinese Eastern Railway would bridge the landmass from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, giving the Russian Empire an unbelievable toehold in Asia-Pacific. The line passing through Manchuria was under the control of a private corporation, the Chinese Eastern Railway Company. The major stakeholder was, of course, Russian, but there was also Qing investment. Now, the protection of the railway, its workers and other infrastructure, was not going to be defended by standard Russian troops. Instead, the company hired special military forces. The engineers were nearly all Russian. The laborers, 100,000 or so, were Chinese coolies. The project was done in collaboration between the two empires, and it heavily depended on China. If the Qing were to, let's say, pull back the laborers, the construction efforts would stop dead. Worse, what if the Chinese began sabotaging the construction? Well, both of these things began in 1900. A railway guard named Constantine Kusov had been in southern Manchuria for 2.5 years. He witnessed the shooting of a Russian captain and 2 Cossacks by Qing soldiers in April of 1900. In May, at the small town of Ha Chung, placards were erected stating the local populace should help exterminate the foreigners. The Boxer movement was hitting Manchuria. Locals told Constantine not to be alarmed. Qing commanders stated the placards were just the work of youthful pranksters. Then one evening, Constantine saw Chinese wearing yellow sashes and headbands speaking through interpreters to Russian commanders. When Constantine approached for a closer look, the Chinese had their lips, cheeks, and eyebrows painted. One of them was doing bizarre gymnastic exercises and shouting at them furiously. A nearby Cossack remarked, "That has to be a boxer." One of the interpreters stated that was not true. There were no boxers in this part of China. The next morning, more boxer youths emerged doing gymnastics in the open. Then the local merchants began to quickly sell whatever arms they had in stock, and blacksmiths began forging knives, swords, and spears. Sabotage work began to occur. Russian telegraph lines were being frequently cut. Attempts were being made to derail trains by lifting up the rails or piling up stuff on the tracks. It seemed to all the Russian-Chinese cooperation was falling apart. Countless interpreters, servants, laborers, they all quit their jobs. Russian supervisors and foremen, who were notoriously cruel to their Chinese workers, no longer lashed out at them. Instead, they walked around armed to the teeth. The Russians also noticed an increase in Qing soldiers, many of whom were not recognized from the area. But the Russian commanders believed the Chinese were a submissive and inoffensive people, so they took all of these signs with a grain of salt. The situation became worse. More railway guards were needed. But as you can imagine, Manchuria is an enormous place. Constantine had roughly 240 men to guard a sector of around 172 miles. Thus, to strengthen one post would weaken another. There were troops in the Guangdong region, on the southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, guarding Port Arthur and Dalian. Colonel Mishinka, commander of the railway guards along the Port Arthur line, requested further troops from Vice Admiral Yevgeny Alexiev, the commander-in-chief of Russian land forces in the Guangdong region and naval forces in the Far East. By the way, I'll just take a moment here to say, the Russian language is not one I am very good at, but I am going to try and pronounce everything as it's supposed to be pronounced in Russian. He was denied. because Chief Engineer Yogovich stated on July the 2nd that the Chinese were peaceful and wanted to continue the joint project. There was also the belief that if they sent more troops, the Qing would be more inclined to the Boxer cause. On May the 23rd, a mob attacked 3 Cossacks that Constantine had sent to purchase supplies for the kitchen. The men escaped, having to saber down a few Chinese. The populace was in an uproar. The Qing commander at Ha Chung demanded Russian troops be barred from the city. In June, Boxers were out in the open, screaming for violence against the foreigners. Many Qing officials refused to collaborate with the Boxers, and they were run out of town. Boxers were taking control over large areas and recruiting a militia. The Boxers began to assemble around Mukden. On July the 2nd, Mishenka telegraphed Constantine that the northern outposts were in serious danger, and he ordered him to rush over to Liaoyang with all the guards that could be spared from southern outposts. A detachment of 56 soldiers and 20 cavalry were raised. Constantine tried to use a locomotive, but the Qing switchmen sabotaged it. Soon Constantine heard word Qing detachments and Boxers were sabotaging multiple railway stations. Outposts were under attack as well. Constantine ordered all construction efforts to cease and for all Russians to prepare themselves at posts for attack. He promised the men reinforcements would soon arrive from the south. Many replied they didn't need help to face off against, quote, Boxer riffraff, whom we would soon teach how to fight. Constantine worried not for the outposts with 15 to 20 men, but some only had a handful of guards. He recalled, I kept thinking, what will they die for? It is too dear a sacrifice for the stubbornness of 3-4 highway railway agents. To die for the Tsar, to die for glory of the fatherland, that is an enviable death. But to let honorable and selfless soldiers perish for the sake of stubbornness or mistake would be regrettable indeed. He ordered the smallest outposts to be abandoned and for the men to rush to the nearest larger outpost. The Russians saw multiple villages emptied of women and children. Railway lines likewise were abandoned. Constantine arrived to Liaoyang with 67 men on July the 3rd, and he quickly made his way to a nearby village called Beitaozu, where the 2nd Company headquarters and Mishinka were. Constantine was informed hostilities had begun in the region. On July the 27th, a railway bridge and barracks near Liaoyang were razed to the ground. The men there were chased off by gunfire from local Qing forces. 2 Cossacks had their horses killed. The telegraph lines were being damaged constantly. Coal mines were being attacked. Mishenka bitterly complained that Port Arthur kept refusing to send reinforcements, and instead berated them for their lack of cooperation with the Qing. Suddenly, a Cossack messenger arrived to the headquarters, reporting 400 Qing soldiers with 100 cavalry and mountain guns were engaging a force of about 50 Cossacks. Casualties were already mounting. Mishenka immediately took 56 railway guards of the 6th Company under Constantine and 25 men of the 2nd Company, led by Shikin, to go save the force. They arrived at the scene of the battle. The Qing were moving around the Russians' eastern side, trying to cut them off from Liaoyang. The Qing were trying to push the Russians towards their main force, over 3,000 men strong, who were advancing upon Mukden. Constantine jumped off the train with his men to hit the right flank of the enemy, but the Qing diverted over to a local village to better prepare defenses against them. The Russian lines advanced quickly, and once they were 300 paces from the enemy, Shikin and his men took the train directly to the village, leapt off, and charged with bayonets fixed. The men screamed "Ura" as they stormed the Qing, who fell into a rout quickly galloping towards Mukden. Many Chinese were killed. In hand-to-hand combat, volleys took the lives as they fled. The Russians reported 200 dead, while receiving just 4 deaths and 5 wounded in return. The victorious Russians returned by train to Liaoyang, reflecting on how the situation had changed considerably. A force of nearly 3,000 regular Qing soldiers were most definitely in league with the Boxers. They had even brought artillery. They would have most likely hit Mukden, and soon they could have been joined by about 10 newly formed Qing battalions. What were the Russians to do in the face of such numbers? On the way back to Liaoyang, Boxers were seen burning bridges over the Xia River. 12 miles south of the city. Russians rushed over to put out the fires and sent patrols to hunt down the Boxers, but none were to be found. As he approached Liaoyang Station, the Chinese switchmen sabotaged the rails and fled. Engineer Girschmann, the chief of railway construction for the southern section that passed through Liaoyang, was ordered by Mishinka to inform Port Arthur of the recent clashes and to again request reinforcements. Girschmann still thought there was no cause for alarm, though. He asserted over 5,000 taels had been given to the local Manchu general in charge of Liaoyang, who promised them that there would be safety for their work. Thus, Girschmann ordered railway employees back to work. Girschmann's train was to be the last train from Liaoyang, as on July the 6th the bridge south of the station was destroyed. Liaoyang was cut off. Girschmann was left behind with 104 civilian employees and their families. The Qing offered Mishinka free passage for all the Russians, but he refused to leave Liaoyang. Instead, he ordered Stabskapitan Sakharov with the 3rd Sotnya to join up with him and demand Port Arthur give them more reinforcements. He dispatched Cossacks to various northern posts to spread the word of what was going on. The message was clear. If they could run to his position, do so, or run for Harbin if it was closer. Mishinka decided to fortify a wooden, iron-roofed, isolated barracks near Beitaozu. His men numbered 204, exhausted from endless patrolling of a vast region. They were enclosed by a 7-foot earth wall, which the Russians, with Chinese labor help, added breastworks. Their shelter was an ice house, where the families were taking cover. Meanwhile, the Qing forces were digging their own trenches on nearby hills to the north, east, and south. The Russians could see them working. Multiple Qing scouts came over to look at what the Russians were doing as well. The Chinese were torching all the buildings the Russians had previously utilized in the villages around Liaoyang. Any Russians caught in isolated posts were tortured and many were beheaded. Barracks, stations, railway lines, coal mines, all were being burnt down. Mishinka was livid that Port Arthur was not sending more men. He was unable to hold indefinitely, and he could not hope to cut his way through. He had nowhere to run. His Cossack scouts report on July the 6th, in all directions Qing forces were seen erecting barricades, moving artillery and fortifying. From Liaoyang, the Chinese began taking pot shots at the Russians, but they were too far away to really hit anything. The Chinese were not advancing. They were too busy plundering what was left behind at Beitaozu. Firecrackers and celebrations could be heard everywhere, as Qing troops arrived from Mukden. Constantine was talking to an interpreter on July the 6th who told him that he had heard rumors the Chinese would attack the next morning. The next morning began with an artillery bombardment. Mishinka watched using binoculars from a breastwork and proclaimed, "They have begun their advance. Forbid the men to shoot needlessly. Instead, begin to fire platoon volleys at those cannons there. They have already adjusted their firewall and must be silenced." Suddenly, grenades were lobbed into the inter-courtyard. One ripped open the stomach of a horse and wounded some men. Rifle fire was cracking from Beitaozu and the nearby hills. Constantine was commanding the southern defenses. Shekin and Sotnik Mamonov were in the east, Denisov in the north, and Mishenka held overall command. The Russians remained calm, taking orders for targets. Mishenka walked the perimeter, encouraging the men on. He was nearly killed twice by rifle fire and grenades. Constantine directed guns at the Qing artillery, and it took a dozen or so volleys to get the Qing to move their positions. Suddenly, a private yelled, "Sir, the Chinese are crawling already from the railway embankment nearby." The Chinese were nearly 400 paces away. Mishenka ordered volleys, and the well-aimed rapid fire drove them back. At 10 a.m., the Chinese were advancing on foot and upon horse, using large carts to cover themselves from fire. The Qing hit the Russian right flank very hard, killing a few and wounding many. The Qing artillery was performing something akin to a creeping barrage, and soon the Qing riflemen were crawling towards the Russian lines. When the Chinese appeared, the Russians opened fire. The defensive lines were small, around 350 square feet. Blood, corpses, and body parts littered the area. The Qing launched several consecutive attacks, but the Russians gutted their offensives. Suffering heavy casualties, the Qing were cautious in their approaches until they withdrew from Beaozi to Lianyang. They had no idea the Russians were on the brink of collapse. Russian munitions had shrunk to just 20 cartridges per man. The men were exhausted. Countless men were literally falling asleep as battles began. The Russian position at Beaozi was critical. They could not survive another attack. There was zero indication Port Arthur was going to send any help. Thus, Mishenka called for a meeting of all commanders. They decided their only hope was to fight their way south towards the Guan Cossack Satnya of Stabskapitan Strakov, who at that time was battling their way towards them. That night, they buried 9 men before abandoning countless costly railway equipment pieces, a ton of silver taels which were dumped into a local well, and all other personal belongings had to be abandoned. Upon seeing the activity, the Qing began another attack. The Russians threw up volleys dangerously as they had only so much ammunition left. Their bayonets were fixed at all times. Instead of waiting for a Chinese wave to close in on them, Mishenka ordered a feint attack. The second company of Malinov and Shekin charged, screaming hurrahs at the Chinese. This was a brilliant move, for it saved everybody else. The Qing fled back to Lianyang to defend the city, allowing the Russians to quickly move south. Constantine led the vanguard. The civilians were all in a panic. Countless Cossacks got off their horses and gave them to the women and children. It was a grueling trek as they marched 2 miles west of the railroad, trying to avoid detection. Only twice were shots made upon them, but they did not respond and simply carried on at a quicker pace. On July the 8th, they reached the Sha River to see its bridge. The Russian barracks and other buildings over at Shahozi had been burned down. There were Chinese corpses and expelled shell casings indicating that a battle had occurred. It would turn out to be the work of a local guard post of 12 Russians. They had been besieged by roughly 200 Chinese. They had locked themselves in their stone barracks, keeping the enemy at bay until their ammunition ran out. Then Boxers came and began burning the doors and windows. Miraculously, a train came nearby and began firing upon the position, shrilling its whistle. The Russians stormed out with bayonets, attacked the Chinese, and then fled for the train to escape to Anshan. Back over at the Sha River area, the Russians saw Strakov with 70 Cuban Cossacks of his 3rd Satnya alongside 40 infantry of the 2nd Company coming forward. They had fought their way from Yingkou to Liaoyang Station only to find Mishenka's party was gone. They had missed each other en route because Strakov had followed the railroad tracks. Strakov reported seeing the Qing plundering the Russian barracks. Some local Christian Chinese also told Strakov that Mishenka and the rest fled south, so he came looking for them. Their numbers were thus bolstered to 307 railway guards and 102 civilians, some of whom were armed and would have to fight. Mishenka's force continued along the railway to Anshan to find its bridge and pump house had been destroyed. However, the telegraph line and the railway to Port Arthur were still intact from Anshan. He dispatched an officer to Port Arthur to give a detailed report of the situation and hopefully to purchase more ammunition. Meanwhile, the wounded and the civilians were escorted to Tashishtao, where Colonel Dembrovsky had a detachment of men. On July the 11th, another 100 men from the Southern Railway posts, led by Porocheks Galievich and Rajalin, joined Mishenka to bolster his men to 450. Now Mishenka was prepared to play the role of a forward detachment and execute army orders. However, Port Arthur was not going to recognize Mishenka's detachment as a regular army force, and thus they would not supply them with artillery or traditional troops for any offensive actions. Instead, Port Arthur ordered him to withdraw to Tashishtao, within army protection. The next day, native Chinese sympathizers reported to Mishenka that 200 Qing troops were approaching. They were a patrol for a much larger army. The Russians had no provisions, nor tents, thus a siege was not going to be in favor for them. They soon found out from a chief of Ha Chung station that over 2,000 Qing soldiers had threatened his station and the railway line there. It seemed senseless to hold on to Anshan. It was better to rush over to Ha Chung to save it from the fate befalling other stations. At 7 p.m., when they were just about to depart, Cossack scouts rode up reporting that a large Qing detachment with artillery were near the eastern heights, and they had engaged some patrols there. Mishenka dispatched Razalian with a half-sotnya to the eastern heights to distract the enemy attention away from their departure. Dawn of the next day, the Russians made it to Ha Chung station. Friendly locals urged Mishenka to avoid Ha Chung because a large Qing force was present, but he was confident in his force after their string of victories. Mishenka requested aid from the 7th Company of the 7th East Siberian Rifle Regiment led by Dombrowski. Dombrowski sent them via train from Tashichao, and they arrived an hour after Mishenka. The western heights near Ha Chung were occupied by Qing troops, who had to be cleared out if the trains were to come closer to Ha Chung. The Russians took cover behind the railway embankment, and they began advancing up the height, shooting from ridges as they did. The Russians eventually began a charge hitting into the Qing right flank, sending them scattering. Cossack cavalry ran down many before being called back to protect against a possible attack coming from the city. The Russians placed 4 artillery pieces on the height and dug in. They now held a good-looking view over the city. At 9 a.m. on the 14th, Dombrowski came over with an additional company of his regiment and a half-battery. The company was led by Captain Ivanov, the artillery by Stabskapitän Petrenka, and Colonel Nikoli Dysenka, who held overall command of the whole detachment. Mishenka sent word to the civilians of Ha Chung to warn them a battle was soon to take place. But before the Russians could launch their assault, Qing forces stormed out of the city to hit their flanks. The 7th Company, 7th Regiment stayed to defend the artillery, while another company of the 11th Regiment took to the right flank, and the 2nd and 6th Companies took the left. Russian volleys and artillery rained hell upon the incoming Qing soldiers. Petrenka led an excellent bombardment, spraying shrapnel across the Qing formations. Soon the artillery began to bombard Ha Chung as the Qing rushed out of its east gate heading for the nearby hills. Ha Chung fell to the Russians' mercy quite quickly, but Dombrowski gave strict orders not to go on the offensive. The Russians did not press into the city. The half-battery and company of the 11th Regiment departed via train back to Tashichao. Half an hour later, the company of the 7th Regiment began loading up onto another train. When the Qing troops saw this, they began swooping down the hills, and they set fire to the train station buildings, the pump house, and the railway bridge. The Qing cavalry even attempted attacking the locomotive carts, but Russian volleys kept them at bay. Slowly, the trains moved south, with Cossacks patrolling their flanks. When they were around 6 miles from Tashichao, Chinese militia forces and boxers with antiquated rifles attacked the trains. Russians leapt off the carts and took cover while returning fire. Razalian led his Cuban Cossack squadron to run down the enemy, killing many. By 8 p.m., Mishenka and his men reached Tashichao. At Tashichao was the South Manchurian detachment consisting of a regiment, a company, a Cossack sotnya, and a field battery. There was also another unit from Huxing Yucheng, consisting of 3 rifle regiments and some stronger batteries from Port Arthur. At Jinzhou was 86 fortress guns and some men of a Cossack regiment that were patrolling the railway line. All of this, of course, was very welcomed, but Mishenka was still livid to learn no additional troops nor ammunition had departed Port Arthur to help them. 170 miles of railroad north of Tashichao was in the hands of the Qing, who continuously argued there was no conflict and no destruction of railways taking place. Constantine estimated property damage incurred by Russia at this point amounted to some 18 million rubles on the southern line alone. Mishenka had lost about 62 men dead, 53 wounded, and 12 were missing in action. Now, over in the province of Fengtian was a Manchu general who was very much against the Boxer cause. He was well-educated, and he realized China did not at this time wield the necessary power to drive out the foreigners, and that the Boxers and their supporters were adding to China's plight. He was zealous, persecuting the Boxers in his province. Many were arrested, many were executed. He then decided he was going to expose their professed invulnerability spells in front of his people. He gathered around 400 arrested Boxers and proclaimed a large execution would take place. The Boxers would be killed by a firing squad, obviously to showcase how their spell would not work against the bullets. He entrusted the execution operation to a general in his army. Yet unbeknownst to him, there were many Boxers within his army, and that general was one of them. The general secretly removed the bullets from the cartridges of the firing squad weapons. He replaced them with blanks. Thus, at the appointed time, the crowds gathered alongside the military governor to watch several volleys fail to kill the Boxers. The Manchu general, in his fury, ran up, grabbed a rifle, and fired 6 times, doing no harm to the Boxers as well. The Boxers stood proud and defiant. They bowed politely to the crowd. People began to cheer them on. The Manchu general kept up his anti-Boxer campaigns, but the public was dissatisfied with them, and his own military was becoming quite insubordinate. The Manchu general reported to Beijing his plight before handing over control to local forces, walking away from his duty. The railway station, located about 10 miles from Mukden, was guarded by the 2nd Transcaspian Rifle Battalion of Poruchik Verievsky. Verievsky received a report on July the 5th that Qing forces were gathering artillery and digging in near his station. He ordered neighboring outposts to join his at once, and the next day the Qing unleashed an artillery bombardment upon his barracks. The Russians estimated the Qing had around 3,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. The Russians trapped in the barracks fired upon the enemy and watched them cut telegraph lines and burn bridges and buildings all around them. At 1 a.m., 14 Russians from neighboring outposts came in rushing from the north, fighting their way over to the barracks. The Russians received word from Chinese Christians that all the outposts were under attack. Verievsky gathered all the troops and civilians he could, and he made a dash over to Mukden Station to find Qing forces plundering it. From there they fled south to the station of Shichaicun, only to find it also burned down, with Russian corpses littering the area. Next, Verievsky led them to Yantai Station, where they ran into Qing forces coming over from Lianyang. They defeated the Qing forces in 2 engagements, and they made their way to Liaoyang. By this point, Verievsky was trying to reconnoiter the enemy positions and find Colonel Mishenka, who was giving out orders for all forces in the region to come to him. From a captured Qing soldier, they learned Mishenka's detachment had fled the area and was being pursued heavily. The railway lines appeared to be destroyed. There was no aid coming from Port Arthur. Verievsky announced they would turn eastward to try and get to Yingkou, where perhaps Russian ships could get them somewhere safe. They traveled east along the Taizu River, running into small Qing forces along the way. Verievsky was hit with a rifle bullet to the chest. Pirepienka took over command and announced they would proceed to Korea for safety. It was a terribly long and arduous journey. They lost many civilians and soldiers. Their story was to be one of many, for Manchuria was falling into chaos. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. My latest episode is in both English and French, and it's on France during the Pacific War. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can listen to exclusive podcasts, such as my recent piece on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. The Boxer Rebellion had spread to Manchuria. Railway stations, barracks, anything foreign was being destroyed. Countless isolated Russian pockets were now under threat, and not just by Boxers, but by a very angry and vengeful Manchu populace.